For over 15 years, the Strait of Hormuz has been studied as the single most valuable choke point on Earth, and nothing prepared serious analysts for what just happened along its southern coastline. Something is unfolding inside the United Arab Emirates that no one predicted. Not the energy analysts in Houston, not the intelligence services in Langley, not even the senior commanders inside Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who built their entire strategic doctrine around controlling this waterway. The route Tehran believed it owned, the route that gave the regime leverage over the global economy, the route that justified 4 decades of asymmetric military investment, has just been quietly and permanently bypassed. The sanctions pressure was expected. The naval confrontations were expected. The diplomatic isolation of the Iranian regime was expected. But what is happening along the eastern coast of the UAE, behind the mountains of the Musandam Peninsula, was never supposed to be possible on this timeline. Abu Dhabi has just executed a calculated maneuver that strips Iran of its single greatest geopolitical weapon, and the regime in Tehran has no military, economic, or diplomatic response available. This is not an incremental shift. This is a structural turning point in the balance of power across the entire Persian Gulf, and credible reporting from regional energy desks indicates the consequences will reach every household in America within weeks. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the subscribe button below this video. Turn on notifications immediately. What unfolds in the coming 72 hours inside the Gulf will change everything Americans thought they understood about energy security, Iranian leverage, and the future of the Strait of Hormuz. In the next few minutes, this analysis will show exactly how the UAE quietly redirected millions of barrels of crude away from Iranian guns, how Saudi Arabia synchronized its own infrastructure to compound the effect, and how the IRGC's entire blockade strategy has been rendered obsolete by a single piece of pipeline steel buried in the Emirati desert. Viewers who miss the next update will miss the inflection point itself. To understand why this moment is so historically significant, the analysis must first go back to 1979. For 46 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran built its entire strategic identity on one unbreakable promise to its own population and to its adversaries, that Tehran controlled the artery of the global economy. Every sanction, every threat, every military encirclement was absorbed and repackaged as proof that the world could not afford to truly confront the regime because Iran sat atop the Strait of Hormuz, and through that 21 nautical mile choke point flowed roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil and nearly a third of all liquefied natural gas. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has confirmed these figures repeatedly across more than a decade of reporting, and the IRGC built its naval doctrine around exploiting them. The architecture of Iranian leverage was deliberate and patient. Beginning in the mid-1980s during the so-called tanker war with Iraq, Iranian strategists studied every vulnerability of Gulf shipping. They mapped the navigable channels, the deep water lanes, the choke radii where a single mine or a swarm of small boats could halt traffic for days. By the early 2000s, according to assessments published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the IRGC Navy had deployed thousands of fast attack craft, anti-ship cruise missiles distributed along the northern coast, and a sophisticated mining capability designed for exactly one purpose: to threaten closure of Hormuz whenever Tehran needed political concessions. This leverage worked. It worked in 2011 when Iran threatened closure during the European Union's sanctions debate. It worked in 2018 when President Trump withdrew from the nuclear agreement and Tehran responded by harassing tankers. It worked in 2019 when limpet mines damaged vessels near Fujairah and oil prices spiked within hours. It worked because the entire industrial world believed there was no alternative. Every barrel of Saudi crude, every Emirati cargo, every Qatari LNG shipment had to transit the strait, had to pass within range of Iranian missiles, had to accept Iranian risk as a structural feature of the global energy system. What most analysts outside the region failed to appreciate, however, was that the Gulf states themselves had spent the last 15 years quietly building the escape route. The first major piece arrived in 2012 when Abu Dhabi commissioned the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, a 360-kilometer line capable of moving roughly 1.5 million barrels per day from the onshore fields of the Emirates directly to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia followed with expansions of its east-west pipeline across the peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, eventually reaching a nameplate capacity exceeding 5 million barrels per day, according to Aramco's own disclosures. These were not theoretical projects, they were strategic insurance policies, and the premiums had been paid in full. But what is unfolding right now in the past several weeks represents something that goes far beyond any previous bypass. Because the UAE has not merely opened an alternative route, Abu Dhabi has executed a coordinated infrastructure surge that, combined with parallel Saudi action, removes the structural necessity of Hormuz transit for the majority of Gulf hydrocarbon exports. And the Iranian regime, watching this unfold in real time, has discovered that its single greatest weapon is being disarmed, not through war, not through diplomacy, but through engineering. This brings the analysis to the first of three developments that together explain why the regime's leverage has collapsed. The first war, pipeline steel versus Iranian missiles, a defeat written in concrete and pumping stations. According to Reuters reporting confirmed by multiple regional energy desks, the UAE has accelerated throughput on the Habshan-Fujairah corridor to record sustained levels, with crude movements through Fujairah port reaching figures that effectively saturate Emirati export capacity outside the strait. The expansion involved new compressor stations, upgraded loading terminals at Fujairah, capable of handling very large crude carriers in rapid succession, and reinforced storage facilities that allow continuous loading regardless of upstream production fluctuations. Industry analysts at S&P Global Platts have publicly assessed that the UAE can now route the overwhelming majority of its crude exports through Fujairah if required, leaving Iranian threats against Hormuz almost entirely without effect on Emirati cargoes. This is not a minor logistical adjustment. This is a complete restructuring of regional energy geography. Every barrel that exits through Fujairah is a barrel that never enters the Iranian threat envelope. Every tanker that loads east of the Musandam Peninsula is a tanker that never passes within range of Iranian anti-ship missiles deployed along Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island. The mathematics of Iranian deterrence depended on the assumption that closing the strait would inflict catastrophic damage on the global economy. Strip out the bypassed barrels and that catastrophic damage shrinks dramatically. The second war, Saudi Arabia versus Iranian time. The kingdom's east-west corridor is being torn wide open. Riyadh has not been passive while Abu Dhabi reroutes Emirati crude. According to Bloomberg reporting and corroborated by Saudi Aramco's own quarterly disclosures, the kingdom has been systematically increasing utilization of the east-west crude oil pipeline, also known as the Petroline, which moves crude from the eastern oil fields across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea terminal at Yanbu. The line's nameplate capacity has been progressively tested at higher sustained throughput, and Saudi engineers have completed pumping station upgrades that allow the system to operate near maximum design parameters for extended periods. The strategic implication is precise and devastating for Tehran. If Saudi Arabia can move 5 million barrels per day to Yanbu, and the UAE can move roughly 1.5 million barrels per day to Fujairah, then between them, the two largest Arab producers can bypass Hormuz on roughly 6.5 million barrels per day of crude exports. Add to this the Iraqi Northern Pipeline through Turkey when operational, the limited but real Omani production that exits entirely east of the strait, and the calculation becomes unambiguous. The Strait of Hormuz, while still strategically important, is no longer the irreplaceable artery that justified Iranian leverage. The closure threat that powered 4 decades of regime strategy has been engineered into irrelevance. Iran's response options are collapsing in real time. Tehran cannot strike Emirati pipeline infrastructure without triggering direct American military retaliation under existing security guarantees. Tehran cannot strike Saudi pipeline infrastructure without inviting the same response and shattering the fragile diplomatic normalization that the regime desperately needs for economic survival. Tehran cannot blockade the strait itself because doing so harms primarily Iranian exports, which still depend overwhelmingly on Hormuz transit due to the absence of any equivalent Iranian bypass infrastructure. The regime has been trapped inside its own choke point. The third war, the war on Iranian credibility, and the regime's own population is beginning to understand. Inside Iran, the economic situation has deteriorated to a degree that internal security services are reportedly struggling to contain. The Iranian rial has continued its long-term collapse against the dollar, with parallel market rates reaching levels that effectively destroy middle-class savings. Inflation, according to figures published by Iranian opposition outlets and corroborated by independent economists, has remained persistently above 40% across essential goods categories. Youth unemployment in the major urban centers exceeds 30% by most credible estimates. And the population that was promised for 46 years that revolutionary patience would yield prosperity is now watching the regime's central strategic claim, control of Hormuz, dissolve into irrelevance. This is where the situation becomes genuinely dangerous for the Islamic Republic. The regime's legitimacy was never built on economic performance. It was built on the narrative of resistance, on the claim that Iran stood at the gateway of global commerce, and the world had to negotiate on Tehran's terms. Strip away that narrative, and what remains is simply an aging clerical structure presiding over a collapsing economy with no compelling story to tell its own citizens. According to analysis published by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and reinforced by recent commentary from former regional intelligence officials, the regime's internal coherence depends critically on its ability to project external strength. The Hormuz leverage was the single most important component of that projection. The connection between these three wars becomes critical here. Pipeline steel defeating Iranian missiles creates the strategic conditions. Saudi Emirati coordination accelerates the timeline, and the regime's own population, increasingly aware that the central strategic asset of the Islamic Republic has been quietly nullified by adversaries the regime claimed to dominate, begins to ask the questions that authoritarian governments cannot survive being asked. What was all of this for? What were the sanctions for? The isolation for? The executed protesters for? The wars in Syria and Yemen for, if in the end the strait can simply be bypassed by Arab neighbors operating with American technology and American security guarantees? The legitimacy crisis is no longer theoretical, it is structural. But the damage goes much deeper than pipeline throughput numbers, because what happened next revealed something far more dangerous than infrastructure competition. The UAE's move was not executed in isolation. According to credible reporting from Defense News and corroborated by statements from U.S. Central Command, the Fujairah corridor expansion has been integrated into a broader regional security architecture that includes American naval presence in the Gulf of Oman, expanded basing arrangements at Al Dhafra and Fujairah, and increased coordination with Israeli intelligence on threat detection along the bypass routes. This is not commercial infrastructure. This is strategic infrastructure, protected by the combined military weight of the United States, Israel, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. Iran cannot threaten it without escalating to a level the regime cannot survive. The fourth dimension of this collapse becomes visible when the analysis examines Chinese exposure. Beijing has invested heavily in Iran through the announced 25-year strategic partnership, with figures reaching $400 billion according to various reports, though actual disbursements have lagged significantly behind announcements. China's calculation rested on Iranian leverage over Hormuz as a hedge against American naval dominance in the Pacific. If Iran could threaten the strait, China gained an asymmetric pressure point against the American security architecture. But if the strait can be bypassed, if the Arab producers and their American protectors have engineered redundancy, then Iranian leverage is worth dramatically less to Chinese strategy. President Xi Jinping is now staring at a Persian Gulf investment portfolio whose strategic premise has been quietly disassembled, and Beijing has limited options to restore the value of the bet. The convergence of these developments produces a situation that no Iranian strategist anticipated. The regime in Tehran is facing simultaneously the structural nullification of its Hormuz leverage, the parallel expansion of Saudi bypass capacity, the integration of Emirati infrastructure into American security architecture, the erosion of Chinese strategic interest in maintaining Iranian leverage, and the internal legitimacy crisis that follows when an authoritarian regime's central strategic claim dissolves in front of its own population. These are not separate problems. They feed into each other. Pipeline expansion accelerates Chinese disengagement. Chinese disengagement deepens economic collapse. Economic collapse intensifies internal pressure. Internal pressure forces the regime toward provocations it can no longer afford militarily. This perfect storm of infrastructure bypass, allied coordination, Chinese exposure, and domestic legitimacy collapse has created something far more dangerous than any single crisis the Islamic Republic has faced since 1979. These are not separate issues. They feed into each other simultaneously. The UAE's pipeline expansion fuels Saudi confidence to push its own bypass capacity further. Saudi confidence emboldens broader Arab normalization with Israel. Arab normalization isolates Iran diplomatically at precisely the moment its economic foundation requires diplomatic openings. And at the center of this storm sits Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who has been almost completely invisible in public for weeks, according to multiple regional intelligence assessments. This is the reality of the Persian Gulf in 2026, not one crisis, but 4 overlapping wars destroying the regime's strategic position from every direction at once. According to credible reporting from energy analysts tracked by Bloomberg and Reuters, the Iranian regime now has only a 10 to 15-day window before the next OPEC Plus production review, a meeting in which Saudi Arabia and the UAE are expected to formalize export commitments that depend explicitly on the bypass routes remaining operational and protected. Every single day this situation continues, Iran is not only losing current leverage, it is permanently destroying future leverage. The pipeline infrastructure being expanded right now will operate for decades. The American basing arrangements being deepened right now will persist across multiple administrations. The Chinese reassessment happening right now will reshape Beijing's calculations on Iranian investment for the remainder of the decade. The window for the regime to extract concessions from the current order is closing, and once closed, will not reopen. The countdown is measurable. Storage capacity at Fujairah is being expanded, with completion timelines published in industry trade journals. Saudi pumping station upgrades have announced commissioning dates within the current quarter. American naval rotations into the Gulf of Oman are scheduled and visible. Each of these milestones, as it is reached, further reduces Iranian leverage and further compresses the regime's options. Within 48 hours, the next round of Emirati loading data will publish. Within 2 weeks, the OPEC Plus ministerial meeting will lock in production assumptions. Within 30 days, the structural reality will be undeniable even inside Tehran. What this means for American interests is direct and significant. Energy security, the single largest variable in American economic stability, is being structurally improved by the engineering of Hormuz redundancy. Retirement portfolios exposed to energy market volatility gain protection as Iranian leverage diminishes. Supply chains that depend on stable shipping costs benefit from reduced geopolitical risk premiums, and the strategic competition with both Iran and China is shifting decisively in favor of the American-led order, not through war, but through the patient engineering of alternatives that render adversary leverage obsolete. This is what calculated, surgical, strategic patience looks like in practice, and the results are arriving exactly on schedule. The question every serious analyst is now asking is what the regime in Tehran will choose to do as it watches its leverage evaporate. The historical pattern suggests that authoritarian regimes facing structural decline often choose provocation over patience, because provocation generates the external threat narrative the regime needs for internal cohesion. But provocation in 2026 carries risks the regime cannot manage. A strike against pipeline infrastructure invites direct American military response. A move against shipping invites coordinated coalition response. A nuclear breakout invites Israeli action that the regime's air defenses, badly damaged in recent exchanges, may not survive. Every escalation path leads to outcomes worse than the current trajectory, and every restraint path leads to continued erosion of leverage. This is what strategic paralysis looks like. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications immediately. The analysis will continue tracking every major development in this rapidly evolving crisis as the bypass infrastructure comes fully online, as the OPEC Plus meeting approaches, as the regime in Tehran is forced to choose between provocation and decline. The next update will examine the specific Saudi pipeline expansion timeline and what it means for global oil prices over the next 90 days. And viewers without notifications enabled will miss the critical inflection points as they happen. Drop thoughts in the comments below. Does the Iranian regime choose provocation in the next 60 days, attempting one final dramatic move against Gulf shipping to restore leverage? Or does Tehran choose strategic patience and accept the structural decline of its Hormuz position? Every single comment is read, and the analysis values the perspective of viewers who have followed this situation closely. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay ahead, and the next brief will arrive as soon as the next development warrants it.